What we're witnessing right now is one of the most catastrophic strategic miscalculations in modern military history, and the Western media isn't telling you the full story. When Vladimir Putin launched his operation into Ukraine, the objective was clear: dismantle Ukraine's military capacity, secure territorial gains, and reassert Russian dominance on the world stage. But here's what actually happened. Russia's own military has been systematically hollowed out. We're talking about the loss of over 700,000 troops, the depletion of Soviet-era weapons stockpiles that can never be replaced, and an economy now burning through 40% of its federal budget just to sustain a war that was supposed to last weeks. The Russian defense industry is cannibalizing itself, pulling chips out of washing machines to build missiles, while NATO has been revitalized in ways Putin never imagined possible. This isn't propaganda. These are the hard, verifiable realities on the ground. The question we need to ask ourselves is this: how does a nuclear superpower with decades of military doctrine make such a fundamental error in judgment? And more importantly, what does this mean for the global balance of power moving forward? Because the implications reach far beyond Eastern Europe. Let me take you back to February 2022, because understanding where this all began is crucial to grasping the magnitude of what's unfolded. The Russian military crossed into Ukraine with what many analysts believed was overwhelming force. We saw columns of armor stretching for miles. We saw elite paratroopers attempting to seize key airports. We saw a coordinated multi-axis assault designed to decapitate the Ukrainian government within 72 hours. The Pentagon was preparing for Kyiv to fall. Intelligence agencies across the West were drafting scenarios for a government in exile. Even Ukraine's own allies were quietly discussing how to manage a post-invasion reality. But something extraordinary happened. The Russian military didn't just fail to achieve its objectives, it began to expose fundamental weaknesses that had been hidden beneath decades of propaganda and military parades in Red Square. Now, I want you to understand something important here. This isn't about celebrating war or human suffering. Every casualty in this conflict represents a profound tragedy, a life cut short, a family destroyed. But we have to be honest about what the data is showing us, because ignoring reality doesn't make us more compassionate. It makes us less prepared for what comes next. The Russian military machine that rolled into Ukraine was supposed to be the second most powerful fighting force on the planet. It had modernized significantly since the Georgian conflict in 2008. It had demonstrated new capabilities in Syria. It had invested heavily in new weapon systems, from hypersonic missiles to advanced electronic warfare capabilities. On paper, Ukraine didn't stand a chance. The conventional wisdom was that Russian doctrine, Russian firepower, and Russian numerical superiority would simply overwhelm Ukrainian resistance within days or weeks at most. But wars aren't fought on paper. They're fought with logistics, with morale, with adaptability, with industrial capacity, and with the ability to sustain operations over extended periods. And this is where the Russian calculation went catastrophically wrong. Let's start with the most fundamental resource in any military conflict: people. Russia began this war with a professional military force that had been built up over years of investment and training. The initial assault forces were supposed to be the best Russia had to offer. Yet within the first few months of the conflict, Russia had suffered casualties that exceeded its losses in a decade of fighting in Afghanistan during the Soviet era. We're not talking about minor setbacks here. We're talking about elite units like the VDV, the Russian airborne forces, being decimated in failed assault operations. We're talking about entire battalion tactical groups being surrounded and destroyed. The Battle of Kyiv alone saw Russia lose more troops and equipment than many countries possess in their entire military inventory. As the conflict dragged on, Russia had to make a choice that no modern military wants to make. It had to mobilize. In September 2022, Putin announced a partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists. But here's what that really meant. Russia was pulling men with minimal training, outdated equipment, and little combat experience into a meat grinder. These weren't professional soldiers. These were mechanics, teachers, office workers, fathers and sons who suddenly found themselves on the front lines of a war that was consuming human life at a pace not seen since the Second World War. And even that wasn't enough. By late 2023 and into 2024, Russia was recruiting convicts from prisons, offering pardons in exchange for military service. It was offering signing bonuses equivalent to several years of average Russian wages just to get bodies to the front. This is not what a winning military strategy looks like. This is what desperation looks like. Now let's talk about equipment, because this is where the situation becomes even more revealing. Russia entered this conflict with thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery pieces, and aircraft that had been built up over decades. The Soviet Union left behind massive stockpiles of military hardware, and Russia had been drawing down those reserves while simultaneously producing new equipment. But modern warfare consumes materiel at a staggering rate. Russia has lost over 3,000 tanks, according to verified open-source intelligence, and those are just the losses that can be confirmed through photographs and videos. The real number is almost certainly higher. To put that in perspective, that's more tanks than France, Germany, and the United Kingdom possess combined. Russia has been forced to pull Soviet-era T-62 tanks out of storage, vehicles that were designed in the 1960s, upgrading them with rudimentary modifications, and sending them to the front because the production of modern tanks can't keep pace with losses. The artillery situation tells a similar story. Russia fires tens of thousands of artillery shells every single day. At the peak of the conflict, estimates suggested Russia was expending somewhere between 20,000 and 60,000 artillery rounds daily. That kind of consumption rate is simply unsustainable without massive industrial capacity, and while Russia has been able to maintain high rates of fire by drawing down Soviet stockpiles and ramping up domestic production, there are limits. Reports emerged throughout 2023 and 2024 of Russia turning to North Korea for artillery shells and to Iran for drones because its own production capacity, even running at maximum surge, couldn't meet the demands of the battlefield. Think about what that means. Russia, which inherited the Soviet Union's massive military-industrial complex, which produces its own steel, its own explosives, its own weapon systems, had to go to North Korea, one of the most isolated and economically struggling nations on Earth, to buy artillery ammunition. That's not a sign of strength, that's a sign of an industrial base that's been strained to the breaking point. But perhaps the most telling indicator of Russia's military degradation is what's happening with its precision weapons and advanced systems. At the start of the conflict, Russia deployed cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and sophisticated guided munitions. These were supposed to demonstrate Russia's technological advancement, its ability to strike targets with precision while minimizing collateral damage. Yet as the months wore on, we saw Russia increasingly resorting to Cold War-era weapons. S-300 air defense missiles, which were designed to shoot down aircraft, were being fired at ground targets because Russia was running short of proper ground attack missiles. Kh-22 anti-ship missiles from the 1960s were being used against land targets. Reports emerged of Russian technicians literally pulling semiconductor chips out of imported washing machines and dishwashers to use in military equipment because Western sanctions had cut off the supply of advanced microelectronics that modern weapon systems require. This gets to a deeper truth about the Russian economy and its ability to sustain this kind of conflict. Before the war, Russia's economy was roughly the size of Italy's, somewhere around $1.8 trillion. It's an economy heavily dependent on energy exports, with relatively limited high-tech manufacturing outside of the defense sector. When Putin launched this operation, he was betting that Russia's economic reserves, its sovereign wealth fund, and its ability to redirect economic resources toward the war effort would be sufficient. But sustaining a major land war in the 21st century is breathtakingly expensive. Russia is now spending somewhere in the vicinity of $100 to $150 billion annually on this conflict. That represents roughly 6 to 7% of its entire GDP. To put that in American terms, that would be like the United States spending $1.5 trillion per year on a single military operation. It's simply not sustainable over the long term without severe economic consequences, and we're already seeing those consequences manifest. The Russian ruble has experienced significant volatility. Inflation has spiked to levels that are eroding the purchasing power of ordinary Russians. Interest rates have been raised to levels that are choking off private investment and economic growth. The Russian central bank has been forced to intervene repeatedly to stabilize the currency. Meanwhile, Russia's sovereign wealth fund, which was supposed to serve as a buffer against economic shocks, has been steadily depleted to finance the war effort. Western sanctions have cut Russia off from advanced technologies, from international financial systems, from the kind of economic integration that modern economies require to thrive. Russia has pivoted toward China, toward India, toward other nations willing to trade despite sanctions, but these are not equivalent substitutes. Russia has become increasingly dependent on China economically, which shifts the balance of power in that bilateral relationship in ways that are not favorable to Russian long-term interests. Now, I want to address something that often gets overlooked in discussions about this conflict, and that's the human capital dimension. Russia is losing not just soldiers on the battlefield, but also its demographic future. Russia already had a demographic crisis before this war began. Birth rates were declining, life expectancy for men was well below Western averages, and the working age population was shrinking. This war has accelerated all of those trends. Hundreds of thousands of young Russian men have been killed or severely wounded, but beyond the battlefield casualties, hundreds of thousands more have fled the country to avoid conscription. These aren't random people. They're often the most educated, the most mobile, the most economically productive members of Russian society. The tech workers who fled to Armenia, Georgia, and Central Asia, the professionals who saw what was coming and got out while they could. This represents a brain drain that will have consequences for the Russian economy for decades to come. Meanwhile, look at what's happened to Ukraine's military. Yes, Ukraine has suffered enormously. The human cost has been staggering, the economic damage has been catastrophic, and entire cities have been reduced to rubble. But Ukraine's military has been transformed. At the start of this conflict, the Ukrainian military was a relatively modest force with Soviet-era equipment and limited capabilities. Today, Ukraine has become one of the most experienced and capable fighting forces in the world. Ukrainian soldiers have been trained by NATO instructors. They've been equipped with Western weapon systems, from HIMARS rocket artillery to Leopard tanks to F-16 fighter jets. They've developed tactics and operational concepts that are being studied by military academies around the world. Ukrainian forces have demonstrated an ability to conduct complex combined arms operations, to integrate intelligence and precision strikes, to adapt to Russian tactics and develop countermeasures. The Ukrainian defense industry has innovated at a pace that's frankly remarkable, producing domestic drones, developing electronic warfare capabilities, creating weapon systems that are being battle-tested in real time. And here's the strategic irony that Putin couldn't have anticipated. NATO, which many analysts thought was becoming increasingly irrelevant in the post-Cold War era, has been completely revitalized. Finland and Sweden, two countries that maintained neutrality throughout the entire Cold War, have now joined NATO. That adds over 800 miles of NATO border directly adjacent to Russia. NATO defense spending has surged across the alliance. Germany has committed to massive increases in defense expenditure. Poland is building what will become one of the largest and most capable militaries in Europe. The Baltic states have fortified their defenses. The alliance has demonstrated unity and resolve in ways that simply weren't apparent before February 2022. If Putin's goal was to prevent NATO expansion and to demonstrate NATO's weakness, the result has been the exact opposite. NATO is stronger, larger, and more unified than it has been in decades. Let me shift gears for a moment and talk about what this means for Russia's broader geopolitical position. Because the military dimension is only part of the story, Russia's relationships with key partners have been fundamentally altered. Take China, for example. Before this conflict, Russia and China had what they described as a strategic partnership without limits. They presented themselves as a counterweight to Western hegemony, two great powers standing together against American dominance. But the realities of this war have shifted that dynamic considerably. Russia now needs China far more than China needs Russia. Russia is selling oil and gas to China at discounted rates. Because it has limited alternatives, Russia is dependent on Chinese manufactured goods, Chinese technology, Chinese financial systems to circumvent Western sanctions. China hasn't provided Russia with military assistance in any significant way because Beijing understands that doing so would risk its own economic relationships with the West. From China's perspective, a weakened Russia is actually advantageous. It makes Russia more dependent, more pliable, more willing to accept Chinese terms in their bilateral relationship. Russia's influence in its own historical sphere of influence has also been diminished. The Central Asian republics, which Russia has long considered within its zone of privileged interests, have been hedging their bets. Kazakhstan has been careful not to support Russia's actions. Uzbekistan has maintained distance. These countries see a Russia that is militarily bogged down, economically strained, and diplomatically isolated, and they are recalibrating their foreign policies accordingly. Even within the former Soviet space, Russia's ability to project power and maintain influence has been called into question. The Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict played out without significant Russian intervention. Belarus remains dependent on Russia, but even Lukashenko has been careful about how deeply he commits to Russia's war effort. So where does this leave us? What are the implications of this massive strategic miscalculation? First and foremost, it means that the military balance in Europe has shifted in ways that are going to shape security arrangements for a generation. Russia will emerge from this conflict with a military that is substantially weaker than it was in February 2022. The equipment losses alone will take decades to replace. The institutional knowledge and experienced personnel that have been lost cannot be quickly reconstituted. Russia's defense industry, even running at surge capacity, cannot keep pace with the losses being sustained. This means that Russia's ability to threaten NATO conventionally has been significantly degraded. That doesn't mean Russia isn't still dangerous. It possesses nuclear weapons, it retains significant military capacity, and it's still capable of causing considerable harm. But the aura of Russian military power that existed before this conflict has been permanently shattered. Second, this has implications for how we think about authoritarian governance and military effectiveness. One of the assumptions that many analysts held was that authoritarian systems had certain advantages when it came to military mobilization and sustained conflict. The ability to control information, to suppress dissent, to redirect economic resources without democratic constraints, these were supposed to be strengths. But what we've seen in this conflict is that authoritarian systems also have profound weaknesses. The lack of honest feedback, the prevalence of corruption, the inability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances, the brittleness that comes from top-down control, all of these factors have contributed to Russian failures on the battlefield. The Russian military wasn't able to tell Putin the truth about its readiness, about the likely Ukrainian resistance, about the sustainability of operations. The corruption that permeated the Russian defense establishment meant that money allocated for modernization often ended up in offshore accounts rather than in improved capabilities. Third, this conflict has demonstrated the enduring importance of industrial capacity and economic depth in sustained military operations. In the age of precision weapons and high-tech warfare, there was a tendency to think that industrial mass production was less relevant. But what Ukraine and its Western supporters have shown is that being able to produce artillery shells, tanks, drones, and ammunition at scale still matters enormously. The countries with deep industrial bases, with the ability to surge production, with diverse economies that can sustain military operations while maintaining civilian prosperity, these are the countries that have strategic advantages in prolonged conflicts. Russia's relatively narrow economic base, its dependence on energy exports, its limited high-tech manufacturing capacity, all of these have proven to be strategic vulnerabilities. Looking forward, the question becomes how this reshapes the global order. Russia will remain a significant power, but it will be a diminished power. Its ability to challenge the West militarily has been substantially reduced. Its economic model has been called into question. Its demographic trajectory is deeply concerning. The choices Putin makes in the coming years will determine whether Russia can recover from this strategic disaster or whether it continues down a path of relative decline. For the United States and its allies, this creates both opportunities and challenges. An opportunity to solidify the security architecture in Europe, to strengthen alliances, to demonstrate that aggression carries real costs, but also challenges in terms of how to manage a nuclear-armed power that has been humiliated, how to provide off-ramps that don't reward aggression but also don't back Russia into a corner where escalation becomes more likely. The broader lesson here is about the nature of power in the modern world. Military force remains relevant, but it's not sufficient on its own. Economic strength, technological innovation, alliance structures, institutional resilience, demographic vitality, all of these factors matter. Putin made a calculation that Russian military power could achieve rapid political objectives in Ukraine, and that calculation has proven to be catastrophically wrong. Russia is not stronger as a result of this conflict. It's weaker. Its military has been broken down. Its economy has been strained. Its international standing has been diminished. And the very objectives Putin sought to achieve, preventing Ukrainian alignment with the West, demonstrating Russian power, maintaining influence over neighboring states, have all moved further from reach. That's what makes this one of the great strategic miscalculations of our time, and understanding why it happened, how it unfolded, and what it means for the future is absolutely essential for anyone trying to make sense of where the world is heading.